Hey folks, hope you all are doing well. I am Karan Bandal from Econosite, your weekly economic wrap from India and around the world. So let's get started with something that will help with climate change. Are electric vehicles truly greener than traditional combustion engine vehicles? To answer this question, we first need to agree on a methodology as to how do we measure the greenness of these two vehicle types and what unit of measurement should be used to quantify that greenness. Let's start with the methodology. We'll compare the life cycle emissions of these two vehicle types to evaluate their greenness. Life cycle emissions are the total amount of greenhouse gases emitted throughout a product's existence. That is, beginning with its manufacturing, then its use and disposal at the end. A standardized unit is used to quantify life cycle emissions. It is called metric tons of CO2 equivalent, which accounts for different types of greenhouse gases and their global warming potential. Consider this. The transportation sector is more reliant on fossil fuels than any other sector in the economy. In 2021, it accounted for 37% of all CO2 emissions from end-use sectors. Transforming this sector into a green one will go a long way in the quest for a greener world. Therefore, if we can establish that EVs objectively have lower life cycle emissions than internal combustion engine vehicles or ICEVs, governments can then step in with policy support to encourage mass adoption of EVs and truly make a difference. So, you can see in the first phase, manufacturing phase, EVs fare far worse than ICEVs with 14 metric tons, 40% higher emissions. Battery manufacturing is to blame for this poor performance, as this high emission intensity can be attributed to the extraction and refining of raw materials like lithium, cobalt and nickel that are needed for batteries. Next phase is its use. This can mainly be split into two stages: fuel or electricity production stage and tailpipe emission stage. ICEVs use fossil fuels as we drive them around, whereas EVs consume electricity to charge the batteries, which allows us to drive them around. Fuel or electricity production is by far the most emission intensive stage in EV's life cycle. The magic happens in tailpipe emission stage, zero emissions for EVs as opposed to a massive 32 metric tons for ICEVs. On top of that, EVs outperform ICEVs in maintenance stage and end of life stage. The net impact, EVs end up having almost 30% lower life cycle emissions than ICEVs. Decarbonizing the electricity sector by implementing renewable and nuclear energy can lower EVs' life cycle emissions even more. Therefore, yes, EVs are greener than combustion engine vehicles over their life cycle. Moving on to China's Xinjiang region and its impact on India's solar exports. Let's talk about solar power in India. There's no doubt that China leads the world in solar power growth and Spain leads the world in solar power as a share of electricity. But India deserves some recognition here. There's good news on two fronts. First, in 2022, India installed 13 gigawatt of new solar power capacity, a record high in India's history. Not only that, solar PV capacity growth accounted for 82% of the country's total power capacity growth. And don't expect the Indian solar power market to slow down. At the end of 2022, 58 gigawatt of large solar power projects were still in the pipeline and another 51 gigawatt were yet pending auction. Just combine the two numbers and India could have 8 years of growth at 13 gigawatt level or 5 years of solar power growth above 20 gigawatt a year. We haven't even talked about small scale or rooftop solar yet. That will be cherry on the cake. Good news on front number 2 is with India's solar PV exports. It is the story of two halves. During the first half of 2022, India's solar module exports were around $50 million. With an enormous jump, growing more than tenfold, exports hit almost $500 million during the second half of 2022. Most of it going to the United States. Why is that? What happened in the second half of last year? The Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act or UFLPA happened. The act aims to prohibit importation of goods into the United States manufactured wholly or in part with forced labor in People's Republic of China, especially from the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region or Xinjiang. The UFLPA was enacted on December 23rd of 2021 and went into effect on June 21st of 2022, just before the second half of last year when India's solar exports began taking off. To sweeten the pot, some Indian solar module manufacturers are reportedly looking at building solar module factories in the United States, taking advantage of the Inflation Reduction Act. Finally, is New Zealand interested in prioritizing economic ties with India? An expert at the Auckland University of Technology in New Zealand pointed out that the neighboring Australia has done a much better job at deepening their economic ties with India. India's economy has risen to become the fifth largest global economy and is predicted to become the third largest by 2030. It is expected India will contribute 15.4% to the global economic growth this year, second only to China. New Zealand needs to prioritize its trade and economic relationship with both the countries. Between 2017 and 2022, New Zealand's trade with India declined by 1 billion New Zealand dollars, largely due to plummeting international student numbers both before and after COVID. Between 2000 and 2023, New Zealand's long-term investment in India was worth just $79.02 million. Australia, by contrast, invested $1.1 billion in India during the same period. A closer relationship with India would help New Zealand address critical skilled labor shortages. Considering India's economic growth over the past few years and its future potential, New Zealand risks missing out if it doesn't start to focus on this trade relationship. In summary, India is getting noticed for her economic performance. Smaller but influential players like New Zealand now seek to share in India's growth story. US-China trade tensions are not subsiding. As a result, China's neighbors are benefiting. The UFLPA enacted in late 2021 helped India's exports. And as one of the solutions to our climate change problem, EVs are indeed more environmentally friendly over their life cycle. I hope you found this week's wrap interesting. I'll speak with you again next week. Until then, take care.